Okay, welcome. Let's talk about a book which is a very famous treatment of a number of themes, but particularly the problem of technology. And we can all appreciate that today this is a most timely book, even though it is now, um, what is it, 80 years old. And sometimes people remark upon the past, particularly what was occurring, say, 100 years ago, 90, 80 years ago, as if that were the Stone Age and we had nothing in common with those people. Whereas the fact of the matter is they were grappling with the very same categories of problem that we are today. We're just further along with our technology and with the massive social experiment uh, that our species has been conducting, or if you like, a certain elite ruling class has been conducting with everyone else for at least 100 years. I would say 112 years. Why do I say 112? With the establishment of the Federal Reserve Central Bank and the passage of the 16th Amendment allowing for, or did I get that wrong? 13th? No, obviously 16th. For the direct taxation by the federal government of the citizens of the United States without allocating those tax revenues to the states. That then helps build um, the federal government into an independent, as it were, and supreme power. Lording it over the states. That's another discussion. So the Abolition of Man was composed by C.S. Lewis. You probably know him as an author of children's fantasy novels, the Narnia series, and they made a film out of it, fairly certain. And yes, they did. I haven't seen the films. I haven't even read the Narnia books. You know what? I did see a Narnia film, but back when I was a kid, they made a cartoon out of it. Yeah, so I did see one of those. Um, but C.S. Lewis, he was also noted as a great literary critic, a kind of popular theologian of unsurpassed precision and insight. I can attest to that. He's outstanding. And a philosopher. And here we're going to encounter, as it were, his take on the spiritual condition of the age. All right. Beginning with his analysis of something resembling a review of a book that was sent to him precisely for that purpose. So, how does the book begin? Um, it starts out with his referring to this high school level textbook on English grammar, right? It's an English grammar and composition book. That's what we would call it today. He just called it a grammar book, right? And he calls it the Green Book, and he calls the authors Gaius and Titius, correct? And he does that um, in order not to effectively embarrass them, because what he has to say about this book is uh, the opposite of complimentary. He scorches their effort. Um, so, what happens when we make statements about something's being beautiful or something's being sublime? Imagine yourself standing in front of you leave Providence or wherever you're at the moment, and you go out to the country. Let's say you go to northern Maine or someplace, northern New York, where there's almost no civilization at all, like between Rochester and Montreal. There are a couple of little, hamlets and townships, but it's almost bare. And you go up there and you climb up to the top of a tree and you look up and you actually see the spread of the stars, and you say, "That's sublime. That's sublime," right? What's going on there? Well, there are two interpretations of this. Now, the authors of the Green Book say what's going on there is that you're not actually describing the object at all. What's out there is just a bunch of balls of gas in the void, right? What you're experiencing, or what you're not experiencing, what you're describing is your experience, right? You're saying my feeling is sublime. And that's exactly what Lewis points out to be utterly absurd. That's not the case at all. When you witness something that you judge to be sublime, and that judgment is accompanied by a feeling which prompts you, right, to make the statement that whatever it is, the spread of the stars, that mountain range, that waterfall, is sublime, your feeling that accompanies the judgment that that's sublime is not sublime. As a matter of fact, it's, if anything, it's a humble feeling. It's a feeling of smallness in relation to what you take to be great and large. Okay. Okay. So that's a little bit. That's the initial correction he directs against these two authors, and which he furnishes to us in order for us to think more clearly about what's actually happening when we make those kinds of judgments. Okay. So what his real target now is to move on to explain what's going to happen to people who study this book, because it's a book for high school students. High school starts in 9th grade, right? And well, here it does. I'm not certain how the system is structured in Britain at that time. He says two things are going to happen to the children who study English grammar and composition with this particular book. Okay. First, they're going to come away with the impression that all statements about beauty and sublimity, they're purely subjective. They're just there in your head. Okay, that's number one. And because they're merely subjective, they're completely unimportant. All right. Okay, very good. And that's a very common sort of attitude. I think we're familiar with that today. Yes, and that's because we're still living in the same period. All right. Okay, so and he points out that these will become unquestioned assumptions that will narrow and stultify the boys' minds 10 years hence, 20 years hence. It's a way of killing the soul, of cutting short having certain types of experiences, and these experiences are ennobling. We should be doing the exact opposite. All right, you get that? So, in a word, Gaius and Titius are not actually teaching grammar, or if they are, they're teaching it poorly. What they are actually accomplishing is conveying the lesson that emotions are, in Lewis's words, in themselves contrary to reason and contemptible. Now, Lewis, now we know something about the broader tradition of ethics because that's what we're studying. It would help when reading this book if we knew something about the history of great literature, you know, because that's what he particularly has in mind. Though he mentions a couple of philosophers, Plato, Aristotle. He observes that over a 2,500 year, that's not a small amount of time, 2,500 year period of human history, of human activity, of speculation, of adventure, of trouble, war, victory, and misery, and so on and so forth. Nearly every thinker lined up on the side opposite of Gaius and Titius. I mean, there's an example, there's an exception here or there, maybe David Hume, but in the main, they all agree that there are certain emotions that are actually, here's the key word, appropriate and fitting in response to certain objects. You're supposed to, in some sense, experience delight before a 2-year-old who's playing in front of you in a very delightful way, walking up to you and handing you stuffed animals and chirping and making little sounds. You're supposed to experience awe before the expanse of the heavens. You're supposed to experience a certain admiration. There's an affective part of that, an emotional part of that. A certain admiration before a hero. You follow me? And if you don't have those experiences, all these persons over a period, and these are the wisest, most accomplished thinkers over that period, they would all think of you as more or less as missing part of human nature. Okay. Now, this idea that there are a set of appropriate responses to different types of experience and objects is encapsulated in St. Augustine's concept of ordo amoris, which we can define as the ordinate condition of the affections. That is the disposition to have the right and fitting emotional responses to the right objects. Okay? And this is something you want. I'll even say it in my own voice. This is something you want to cultivate. This is something you want for yourself. It's about becoming more fully human. And I mean, it's something I've had to work on, and I'm still working on it, to be perfectly frank with you. With respect to certain things, I would say I'm probably a Philistine, actually. And will continue to grow in this particular respect. But I know that growth is necessary, right? I have that much going for me. I know that I'm defective in some respects and have to keep working on some things. So he shifts gears now and says, perhaps what Gaius and Titius are doing is not actually accidental. It's not something they weren't aware of. Maybe they actually want to produce a certain type of person with their text. Okay. He calls it the urban blockhead and the trousered ape, the person lacking in any kind of ability to have these experiences and can't even comprehend that anybody would want to have such experiences. Okay, that's really the kind of nadir there, where someone just dismisses even the desirability of having appropriate responses to the appropriate experiences and objects. However, Lewis, now it is an appeal to authority, but take it as you will. Joining and he was a great scholar of literature. Okay, so he knew something about this. Joining the company of this 2,500-year tradition of poets and philosophers and theologians and people of that sort. He makes the following observation, which remains with us for the remainder of the book. This ordo amoris, right? And it'd be good for you to remember what that is. This belongs to the nature of things, or let's put it this way. It's been assumed by this tradition that it belongs to the nature of things. It belongs to the way of things. Now he's invoking the Chinese tradition there, Chinese philosophy, particularly Lao Tzu and his philosophy of the Tao. He also, Lewis offers us the image of the abyss, from which all things emerge, common image in the mystical literature. He says all of this we can more or less summarize with one concept, the Chinese concept of the Tao. Okay, the Tao is that from which all things emerge, as it were, and it's the emerging as well, and it's the emerging in accordance with a certain order. And part of that order is visible in nature, and part of that order is the ordo amoris, the appropriate responses we have to the things of nature, not to mention human things. So he makes a couple of observations which are worth noting. Sentiments in and of themselves are not true or false. They're reasonable or unreasonable, right? So if you experience awe before the starry heavens, well, the feeling is not true. Your judgment that they are awesome is true, and the feeling would prompt that true judgment. Okay, that's just a small point, but an important distinction to keep in mind. Persons who operate within the Tao, when they educate their students, they're initiating them into something. They're initiating them into a tradition which itself feeds from the Tao. However, Gaius and Titius seem to be doing something different. They seem to have aligned themselves, as it were, to the rebel party, the party that has looked upon 2,500 years of persons drawing from the Tao, and who have said to themselves, we're going to do something else, okay? We're going to oppose the Tao. As a matter of fact, we're going to set ourselves up in opposition to it and with a view towards dominating it, okay? We are going to embark upon the project, as Descartes put it, of becoming masters and possessors of nature. And we can reformulate that. There is a part of the population, they've been around for a long time, and they include alchemists and magicians and shamans and things of that sort. I mean, they've always been around, who they intend to become masters and possessors of the Tao. You follow me? It's really it's a kind of practico-theological project, trying to will themselves to be God in some way. Anyway, so individuals who have embarked upon that project, not of humbly submitting themselves to the Tao, but setting themselves up on their own authority and exalting that authority over the Tao, when they educate their students, they're not initiating them into the Tao, they're indoctrinating them into their own doctrine, okay? So you can see how Lewis doesn't put it this way, but I'll put it this way. There's a real opposition here and a dispute concerning the center and the true possessor of sovereignty. You guys follow me? The sovereignty and authority belong to the Tao, and so we have to subordinate ourselves to it. Or does sovereignty and authority belong to oneself, at least if one wills such sovereignty, so that the project would be to subordinate and subjugate the world to oneself? Now, he didn't use those words. I'm putting those in there for you because I think actually that's what it's really about. Okay, and that clarifies the basic opposition. How far did we get in Nietzsche? Yeah, I think towards the end of Nietzsche we observed some of that distinction operative. Okay, so when you're by reasoning, can you teach yourself to experience awe before the heavens? You might get to the point where I am, where you realize that you have to cultivate, a richer emotional experience in reaction to objects that call for such experiences. Okay, you can't create them, right? These sorts of emotions have to be induced over the course of a boy's youth or a girl's youth. He was an educator of boys, so he tended to think about boys. Okay, but over a child's youth, by affording that child, the appropriate experiences, the appropriate reading, and the appropriate instruction, right? And part of that is religious training, obviously, right? Okay, so the result will be to enlist, he says this, the result will be to enlist the spiritedness. Now, what's the spiritedness? That's the seat of your sense of honor. It can flare up in wrath and indignation, okay? It's also the seat of, milder affects, like irritation or something of that sort, okay? But reason has to enter into alliance with, or rather, put the yoke on spiritedness, which itself then henceforth voluntarily places itself in the service of reason. Okay. Now, he doesn't explain exactly how this works at the level of a fine-grained philosophical psychology, but we get the basic idea. Reason is to rule the whole man. He says the stomach, but reason is to rule the whole man via the chest, or the head is to rule the stomach via the chest. And what he's suggesting, he doesn't spell it out very clearly, but what he's suggesting, it seems, is that this faculty of spiritedness, he's taking this from the Greek term thumos, which we looked at the beginning of the semester, actually, Thumos, right, in connection with Plato. He's suggesting that this is actually the seat of all those various feelings of a humble feeling, which corresponds to the judgment of the sublimity of the waterfall, right? Or again, a kind of humble feeling which accompanies and prompts the judgment that that man is a highly admirable man, a great man, right? You guys follow? And so on. That these have their seat there. Because beneath spiritedness, so the ordo amores, right, links spiritedness to the whole cosmos, right? So if I can do that, I can even type that in there. So, okay, so the faculty spiritedness is linked to the entire cosmos via the ordo amores, okay? I'm going to leave it at that. That seems to be where he's leaving us. He doesn't work this out into a philosophy of the person, so we're not going to try to develop it ourselves, and we'll just leave that as a pregnant suggestion. You can pursue that at your own leisure. So chapter 2 is called The Way, or if you like, the Tao. The Way is an English translation of the Tao. One sinologist or a couple of sinologists translate it as way making, right? The actual process by which things, as it were, emerge out of concealedness into presence and pass back into concealedness and so on, right? The temporalizing process of the cosmos. Okay, there's a Western philosopher named Martin Heidegger, who takes up this idea. He discovers it independently of the Chinese and develops it. Then when he found the Tao Te Ching with this idea spelled out, he became a great enthusiast and actually cooperated in the translation of that work into German. Okay, so now of course let's say something commonsensical with C.S. Lewis. Gaius and Titius must have written their book for a purpose, right? They had something they were trying to accomplish. And whatever it is they were trying to accomplish, they thought that that is something good and good in itself. It's an unavoidable feature of human psychology and volition. You guys follow me? We are the kind of being that makes choices. When we make choices, we make them with purposes in mind. Okay, and we have a finer grained analysis of this from Hegel that we can rely upon. So purposes and intentions, you can bring all that in if you like. And whatever it is we have in mind, of necessity, we posit that as being good, right? And we saw that that was even true of the person who tries to distance himself from all of his choices. Well, you make a choice, you are, as it were, even reluctantly, however reluctantly, doesn't matter, you are preferring something to everything else at that particular moment, and that counts as good. Okay, so hence, what are Gaius and Titius really doing? Okay, their real operation was to debunk values they do not like. And a second thing, this is a very important part, not to be overlooked, to leave other values that they do like untouched. Okay? So you want to destroy some and preserve the others. It's just like every single thinker who publishes something or other. Okay? They have their aims and they despise the aims of their opponents. So they want to destroy the aims of their opponents and the values of their opponents and leave theirs intact. Their opponents are in the business of destroying the first group of persons' values and aims and leaving theirs intact, right? And that's just turn on any news program, and that's what's. Isn't that amazing? News is no longer. It doesn't even pretend to be a neutral reporting of the facts. It's all editorializing now, right? Okay, so you get this kind of factual report hyphen editorial to the point where once I noticed how blatant this was, even I wasn't following the news very carefully for a while, but let's say starting in 2017, when I noticed that just blatant facts were being regularly omitted and non-facts were being created out of thin air, or little tiny events were being magnified and made into the entire meaning of something that had 100 other facets, I realized that all of this is propaganda. All right, so here's some of the things these fellows like. They like middle class peace, right? A quiet, cozy middle class neighborhood. No crime. Everyone knows one another more or less, and they're relatively friendly, polite to one another. Okay. They like liberalism with respect to religious views. Okay. So they would love the First Amendment. Now he's writing in Britain, right? But they would love the First Amendment of the United States of America. Okay. Whatever Christian denomination, Judaism, whatever sub-branch of Judaism, Islam, whatever sub-branch of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, it's all good. We're all good. Okay. We just don't attack one another. Everything's fine. They like democracy. Okay. They like the idea that the majority, that the people have authority. Now, as you know, Great Britain has a monarchical. Well, they have a constitutional monarchy with the flavor of democracy in one respect, but they're also, of course, a monarchy. And they say King Charles III is a figurehead. Apparently, he has cancer now. Be a short reign if that takes him down. But other persons suggest that behind the scenes, actually, no, he does make important decisions. He keeps those. He conceals those from the public, but actually they do have authority. I don't know one way or another. There's no way for me to know. So the values that Gaius and Titius want to destroy, right, are associated with, or are those of nobility, of sacrifice, and of honor. Okay, so the ideals we associate with patriotism, okay, with a certain kind of ancient and how to put it, a certain kind of ancient adherence to and love of one's religious community, right? If you turn it to Catholic communities, there's all sorts of, that's all gotten watered down in the meantime. If you look at that literature prior to basically to 1962, it's basically monarchical in its flavors, right? In its the metaphysics of Christianity is that all of creation is, it's a monarchy. God's at the top. God's three persons, but the Holy Trinity is sovereign. Okay, period. Okay, so Gaius and Titius regard these values, patriotism, nobility, honor, sacrifice. They regard these as illusory. Okay, and so what Lewis suggests is that they regard them as illusory in favor of more basic or realistic values. And these clearly what he has in mind are the values that we could somehow perhaps derive from modern scientific doctrine. So, for example, the theory of natural selection, which is sometimes they call it the theory of evolution. Well, life forms seem to have evolved over a period of time. That's like the fossil record is pretty scant, but to the degree that we can get some information from it, there seems to have been an evolution of life forms. Okay, you can go over to the Peabody Museum and Yale University for a tour through some of this. But it's natural selection, which is the mechanism, which explains how that happens. Okay, so I call it the theory of natural selection. Okay, so maybe on the basis of such a theory, we can derive an ethics. There are lots of books out there on this, evolutionary ethics, okay, published after C.S. Lewis, like published in the 90s and things like that. So Lewis makes the obvious observation here. This is the first thing any philosopher would say about this, including the people trying to do it. Like it's one of the first things they say on the beginning of the book. Here's the problem I have to deal with. This attempt at founding values on scientific facts, or facts about nature, really, that founders on the impossibility of deriving what one ought to do for what is the case. Okay, you guys follow? I mean, so I gave you this example in an earlier lecture. I mean, it's slightly offensive, but it's undeniable, right? It is the case that there are certain sexual crimes that are happening. Does it follow from that people ought to commit sexual crimes? Well, no. Right? So you have to be very careful. So apparently, people who want to found values on facts about nature, they have to select out, right? They have to select out certain things that happen in the natural world and found their values on those, and ignore the other things that happen in the natural world and refuse to found values on those. Or they can go ahead and found values on those, but then they end up looking like moral monsters. So in the first case, if you want to pick out the stuff that supports a kind of common sense decency, then as a matter of fact, you're not relying on nature. You're presupposing your sense of decency as a standard, and you're using that to then look into nature and select out those features of nature which correspond to it, and then you say those support it. Okay, but you're not really deriving morality from nature. You're finding correspondences between a morality which you assume to be true and things that happen in nature, factual events and features of nature. You can do that if you please. I'm not saying don't do that, but don't pretend you're founding morality on nature if that's what you're doing. If you go in the other direction and become what we call a social Darwinist, or someone who maintains that the survival of the fittest ought to be read into human affairs, as did Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, right? In that, you become from the two names I just mentioned are suffice to indicate what you've become. You become a moral monster. And you could add the Bolsheviks to this as well, because they themselves talked about improving the Bolsheviks, people who founded the Soviet Union, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky. They talked about improving our species. Trotsky was absolutely frank about this. He basically was what we today would call a transhumanist. He wrote about this back in the 20s. All right. You want to understand, these people killed tens of millions of people in their social experiment. And, we feel like we're shielded from that. We're as shielded from that as we are from something that happened in 8000 BC or something of that sort, right? I'm taking it back to 8000 because now we have Göbekli Tepe. We know that there are human human societies that predate the Sumerian. Okay, so you have those two possibilities. Either you can become a monster, or you can just pretend to be founding. You can just pretend to be founding your morality on nature, while all you're doing is actually finding a correspondence. Okay, so enough about that. So let's say the community is in danger. Let me back up for a second here and just try to maybe work out how people who are pro this project would reason. So the community is in danger. This is a fact, right? The community is in danger. There's some people coming over the hill to attack your community. Ought you to protect that community? Okay, so we would say yes, but note that the fact that you ought to protect the community does not follow from the mere fact that the community is in danger. Maybe the community is like Sodom and Gomorrah and deserves to be destroyed, right? Or maybe nothing. Maybe there is no connection between a mere fact, a brute fact, and what you ought to do. You guys follow me? So that it's not the case from the fact that the community, if you have this scientific worldview and you think that there's nothing but pure facts out there, you don't have to believe that. You could believe that what we call pure facts don't exist. Everything has moral qualities attached to it. But if you believe that there are pure facts out there, then from that pure fact, it does not follow that you ought to let the community be destroyed, nor does it follow that you ought to defend it. Okay? To derive the conclusion that you ought to defend it, you have to add another judgment. Here it is. One ought to preserve one's community, right? Right there. And that has the word ought in it. See that? So you'll never determine what you ought to do by a mere appeal to what is the case, when you understand what is the case to be a mere fact. Okay? So that one ought to preserve one's community is arguably not a norm derivable from biological facts. Now, one can contest that, but that would seem to be the case. We'll dig in a little bit further here to see if we can make more sense of it. So the persons who wish to derive a morality or a set of values from the facts of nature, he calls these the innovators. Later, we'll see the controllers. Those are his two big opponents in this book. So the innovator's goal is to set aside the Tao, right? They want to become masters and possessors of the Tao in my vocabulary, or my modification of Descartes. And all of the ought statements that inhabit the Tao. The Tao comes along with a set of imperatives. Do this, don't do that. You ought to do this. You ought not to do that. You ought not to pick people's pockets, right? You ought not to steal. You ought not to slander your neighbor. It's going to cause damage to the community. Okay. You ought to honor your parents. After all, you wouldn't have gotten you wouldn't have lived a week without them when you were young and helpless. Okay. So there is presumably an instinct to preserve the species. Let me back up for a second. So let's try to carry out this derivation they're talking about, right? We don't want to defeat a straw man. We want to give them a fair shot. So let's see if they can do it. There is presumably an instinct to preserve the species proved by science, right? Isn't there some kind of instinct to preserve the species? Well, that's present in a number of ways. We acquire food and shelter. Acquire food, seek shelter. We defend ourselves and those to whom we are related, right? So 1, 2. So there's the appetitive instincts, and there's the irascible instinct. The irascible is that which leads to self-defense. And then there is the procreative instinct. And we're not content with our remaining alive and protecting our consanguineous relations. We want to make more of them, right? Because somehow our body knows that we have an expiration date attached to us. We're going to disappear. It's not good enough just for us to enjoy the fruits of the earth for 60 to 80 years and then pass on. We want to leave people behind us so that they can have enjoy existence as well. Okay, so very good. So there are a couple of instincts right there. Okay, we want to preserve the species. The sexual instinct is actually an aspect of that. I separated it here, but it's really part of it. So Lewis observes, the appeal to instinct is an appeal to fact. Okay, we have these instincts. That's true. We do have instincts, right? Let's just grant that that's true. I mean, we have impulse. Like, for example, you're standing on the sidewalk, like right at the edge of the sidewalk, and you weren't not paying attention, and a bus comes by you, and it's maybe it whizzes by at 40 miles an hour, just 2 feet away from you. You're going to involuntarily step back, right? That's your instinct, your survival instinct. Pardon me for a second while I sip some water. Okay. These instincts, he says, this is Lewis now, or me paraphrasing him. They don't bring us any closer to the ought, the ought statements that we're trying to justify. Okay. Instead, let's see. Look at what Gaius and Titius do. So pardon me for pausing there. Gaius and Titius are engaged in an argument, which is one that discriminates between acting from certain impulses, right, which then express themselves in feelings, from other emotions, which prompt one to certain types of action they disapprove of. So I make this clear as possible. Some of your emotions prompt actions that are noble, sacrificial, and honorable. These they want to maintain are illusory. Other feelings arguably are prompted by instinct, right? That's what's real, okay, for Gaius and Titius. And that's what should be cultivated. Now, there's a whole history of people, our entire tradition would look at that and say, what Gaius and Titius are trying to do is reanimalize us, to reduce us to our basest possible level. The acting from a sense of what is noble and honorable, and with a spirit of sacrificial love, right, and patriotism and piety, okay, acting and love of God, acting from these higher impulses. That's what makes us human. You guys follow me? You're supposed to be that. And if you don't achieve that level of motivation and moral formation, that's a misfortune. Okay, that's how the entire tradition has looked at that. One's supposed to love one's brother, one's sister, one's wife, one's children, one's parents, one's community, and the species, and act from that noble love of those persons and our species as a whole, and for God. Okay, that's the teaching of our tradition. You guys follow me? All right. But if you want to step outside of that and get rid of it, mow it down, which is what Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin did. I mean, this is not mere theory here. It's not just two mediocre grammar teachers in the 40s carrying out some peculiar project, which is actually rather dangerous. It existed full blown. It's a full blown social experiment that had already killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. So you wonder why Lewis doesn't make those connections. I guess they didn't occur to him as he was writing the book, or he deliberately wanted not to get. Probably he was very smart, was aware of these things, and very, very well read. He probably didn't want to get involved in any political controversy at that moment. Okay. So this procedure of theirs strongly suggests that instinct is not really all that instinctual after all. Okay, what does that mean? What is an instinct? An instinct is something which expresses itself spontaneously. It's a spontaneous impulse which ought to necessitate a certain type of action. The spontaneous impulse of the beaver, to return to our friend the beaver, is to build a dam. And that's what he does. It's a complex set of impulses, actually, but he has no choice but to build that darn dam. Whenever you unleash a beaver in the right habitat, he starts building dams. That's what it is. Are we like that? Actually, I think we're quite the opposite. We're quite the opposite. We've already seen this stuff with Hegel. We have an instinct to preserve ourselves, right? Hobbes based his entire philosophy on that. But people commit suicide all the time. How many people? 20, 30, 40,000 people, 50,000 people a year in the United States alone. So apparently that instinct is not infallible. right? It doesn't operate with a kind of ineluctable force. You guys follow me? So it turns out that in human beings, instincts are no longer instincts, if you like. They get overridden by reason. And now what Gaius and Titius have to do, in fact, is enter into that field where people have a range of choices. They have to enter into the field of freedom and start arguing, trying to persuade us to adopt those values, which can be traced back effectively to animal instinct, the instincts that we share with pigs and horses. That's their project. Okay, very good. But they have to convince us to do that. So what they have to actually argue is that you ought to behave like a pig and a horse. Not at the fine-grained level. You don't have to go find a field and run full speed or roll around in mud. But, aim at animal comforts. All right? Full belly. Getting on with your neighbor horses, and so on and so forth. That's it. You guys follow? As far as democracy, it seems to drop out because I don't think horses vote. Neither do pigs. All right, so one might appeal to a higher instinct to obey instinct, he says. Or maybe there's a higher instinct. But what tells you you should obey that higher? Why ought you to obey that higher instinct? Is there a higher instinct? Well, that just goes on forever and accomplishes nothing. Okay. Further. Okay, so up to this point, let me back up for a moment. He's been talking about the instinct to preserve our species. Very good. He puts it in a very peculiar way, an instinct to serve or to benefit posterity, which is broader than preserving, right? The instinct to benefit posterity. What in the world is that? Now we see what's happening. Gaius and Titius believe in scientific progress. Amazing. Okay, so there are two things going on here. We need to derive our values from the impulses that we share with pigs and horses, and we need to have a view of the future, which pigs and horses don't have, incidentally, which impels us to benefit posterity. Okay, that means improve their lot. That means make contributions to scientific progress. Okay, now we see what's happening here. Okay. Now, difficulty there is this, the obvious difficulty. We have another instinct, again, which you can override, but it operates most of the time, instinct to self-preservation. And that pulls in the opposite direction, right? So we have an instinct to self-preservation, and apparently it turns out an instinct to sacrifice, only the kind of sacrifice that Gaius and Titius approve of. Not sacrifice for the sake of your political community or your family or whatever it is, but sacrifice for the sake of people you've never met and by definition cannot meet, because posterity is that group of people who fill the world after you're dead. You guys follow me? So which of those two should you obey? Your instinct to preserve yourself? And by the way, you want to preserve yourself in comfort, right? I mean, Hobbes is right about that. Should you pursue comfortable self-preservation, or should you sacrifice yourself to a group of people you'll never meet? Okay. By the way, I'm not dismissing that we should take into account the well-being of future generations. I think we should. My point is, Lewis's point is that there's an opposition here. So which instinct are you going to act on? So appealing to instinct doesn't help. You don't know what to do. You can't derive what ought I to do in this particular circumstance simply by appealing to instincts. You'll get frozen in place because the instincts pull in two different directions. That means you have to reason things out. And it turns out you have to rely upon the Tao. You have to go to the Tao, guys, in order to reason these things out. You can't rely on instincts. It can't happen. So the innovator himself admits that many instincts need to be controlled. Okay, so I think we pointed this out before. So Gaius and Titius and his innovating scientific progress crowd, they're the first to admit that there's an aggressive instinct. There's an entire branch of biological science dedicated to the study of the aggressive instinct. Konrad Lorenz founded this. He said, well, but we shouldn't act on those, right? Because they value peace. Okay, very good. So apparently it's not true. We should act on all of our instincts. As a matter of fact, some of them we ought not to act on. So they're relying upon a prior moral theory, which they draw from the Tao. And then they pretend that that's supported by the facts drawn from biological science. And by now we've seen that that's just unsupportable. They haven't shown that at all. As a matter of fact, the opposite has been shown. Okay, so what we need actually to do, and what we actually do as human beings, is we rank order our instincts. A very common rank ordering is to prefer the preservation of our community over self-preservation, and that's the ethic which enters into the life of the soldier. Okay, and so soldiers will. I understand soldiers shoot in the air over the head of the enemies, and some of them, they go AWOL. But if all of them did that, then no war would be won by anyone ever. So there are soldiers who are soldiers, and they live by the ethic of subordinating themselves to the community. That's the ethic of sacrifice. How they manage to order their instincts? By recourse to the Tao, to moral traditions, to the nature of things, if you like, to the Ordo Amoris too. How one's supposed to feel about these things. You're supposed to love your community, right? You're supposed to love your family and God, according to this tradition. All right. So, let's see. We'll skip H, go to I here. So, well, we've observed this. The instinct to benefit posterity cannot be satisfied, right? Because posterity is what comes into existence the instant you're dead. All right. So, since it can't really be satisfied, there isn't really, there can't possibly be a very, very strong motive to do that, to enlist yourself in the army of scientific progress. So that's going to require reason and persuasion as well. They're going to have to draw from the Tao. So the Tao is the repository of reasons and values one can appeal to in order to exhort individuals to conduct themselves in a certain way. And that's that. Humani nil a me alienum puto. Pardon my cracking voice. I am a man. Nothing human is indifferent to me. However you wish to interpret that. Well, I'll let you kind of let that roll about the tongue. These considerations destroy the foundations of an ethics based on instinct. There is no such ethics. But they leave untouched the Tao. As a matter of fact, they presuppose and reinforce the fact that we live within the Tao. And the central precept of the Tao is, well, it's the golden rule, it turns out, right? The first formulation is do not do unto others as you would not have others do unto you. And then there's a positive formulation, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, okay? And that's offered by Confucius, Confucio. I'm certainly mispronouncing that, but Confucius is how we say it here. And the great Chinese philosopher, right? And of course, present in the Holy Bible and was uttered by the person of Jesus. Okay, these are part of our tradition. And so a few points to clean things up. Lewis says, of course, there's a duty to posterity, right? There's some kind of duty to future generations. We might not feel it very powerfully a lot of the time, but if you reflect upon it, you see, yeah, we have a duty to kind of leave things intact so they can get on decently 100 years from now. So environmentalists are always saying. But that duty is rooted in the Tao, not in scientific instinct or scientifically confirmed biological instincts. Second, the Tao is the repository of all self-evident moral rules. Okay? Do not steal, do not kill, don't cheat on your wife, don't lie about your neighbor, honor your parents and honor God. That's more or less the whole, and don't envy people. That's all the 10 Commandments right there. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Well, God is a being of infinite merit, so the least you can do is put aside 1 day a week in order to cultivate a relationship with him and honor him, so on and so forth. These things are just self-evident from the standpoint of the Tao. Okay, and some of you are writing a paper trying to explain how Nietzsche has actually succeeded in stepping outside of the Tao and offering us an alternative. And his alternative morality is that of continuous self-overcoming. Wonderful. I like the idea of improving. That's a nice idea. So I agree with Nietzsche if that's what he means. But that's not merely what he means. He's talking about creating new values. Creating new values. Okay, what new values can he possibly mean? Something other than beauty, something other than sublimity, something other than goodness, apparently. That's a value we've inherited. something other than truth, apparently, because that's a value, again, we've inherited. What's he talking about? Okay, when he's talking about creating new values. Okay, strength. He's a big fan of strength. Yeah, but we've inherited that value. People have been praising strength. It's praised in the Christian tradition, guys. So, and you don't find any praise in the Christian tradition of being a coward and sniveling and more or less paddling about, not accomplishing anything. That doesn't exist. What's praised is stooping from a position of strength and lifting those other poor souls up to your position of strength. That's what's praised. So he has that wrong. Okay, so think about that, guys, before you potentially harm yourself very profoundly by trying to create values which cannot be created because there are no values that can be created. Okay, so if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, he observes, nothing is obligatory at all. Okay? If nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing is obligatory at all. Oh, I just had an insight as to what's happened. Okay. So the innovator requires the Tao. So you can't, well, we've proven that. But this includes the values of justice and good faith, which are based on moral merit. Justice is based on moral merits, giving a person his due, her due. Good faith is based upon the institution of friendship, right? These are all realities we inherit from the Tao. I see what's going on with Nietzsche now. You're the first group of people, you're the second maybe group of people in 30 years of teaching who have a positive reaction to Nietzsche. Now I understand why. Everyone else thought he was a wild-eyed lunatic and said, I can't deal with him. I mean, he's praising the blonde beast descending on people and killing them. And he's full of bloodlust. Who could deal with this guy? You guys used AI to study Nietzsche, right? That's where you got it. And so you got all this idea of self-overcoming and being free, and you can experiment with a certain burning with a hard gem-like flame in the shade produced if you abandon mercy and just kind of focus on your own feelings. That's a recipe for a kind of dysfunctional egoism. And it's not, so I don't mean to punch below the belt here, but Nietzsche did go insane at the age of 40, and his crazy philosophy may have had something to do with that. All right, so here we go. Like I said, okay, so I'll stop talking about him. You guys are probably getting irritated at me for trying to inoculate you against something which is obviously harmful. So nonetheless, a long string of philosophers have attempted to offer novel ethical doctrines to humankind. That's true, okay? Let's call these novel ethical doctrines ideologies. Each is actually the result of severing one part of the Tao from the whole and discarding the rest. Okay, so you have so the Tao contains a whole set of values, a whole series of them. All right. Well, what if you take one and magnify it and make it the whole thing? Well, Oscar Wilde said, "Let's live for art. Art for art's sake" was his motto. Okay. And then you can read the book. I'm not sure I recommend it, but you can read the book, "The Picture of Dorian Gray," about the kind of life that Wilde actually approved of. Okay, and that'll speak for itself. Strength, creativity, and self-overcoming without mercy or regard for the weak. That's what Nietzsche advocates, and his followers in Nazism. Authenticity and resolve in the face of death. Okay, that was offered to us by Heidegger. I mean, it sounds pretty good, but he blows it up into the whole thing and leaves out everything else. Radical responsibility for one's values based on pure freedom. It sounds pretty, like a variant of Nietzsche. That's Jean-Paul Sartre. And sacrifice for the sake of science in the future. That's a whole. It's hard to assign that to any one particular name. If you want, we can put a name in there if you like. How about H.G. Wells? Okay. He certainly represents that in some respect. H.G. Wells, I guess Julian Huxley. I mean, these are sort of like second tier figures in the history of ideas, but they're famous enough, right? And any of thousands of scientists who have enlisted. And Elon Musk, okay? Elon Musk, sacrifice for the sake of science in the future. People like that, okay? hundreds of other people, thousands. Okay, these ideologies, each of them is an abstraction from the Tao, and the value that you abstract from the Tao is an amplified made into the whole thing. So all of them are distortions. It's like taking a hand and blowing up a hand and saying that's a human being. Well, that's not a human being, or a foot. Or you can take an internal organ, if you like, the spleen, and just blow that up. That's all I'm going to focus on. I'm just going to have a spleen. And that obviously produces a caricature. Okay. So the Tao is the source of a tradition which actually develops, he concedes. It's point number 7 there. The Tao does develop within the tradition that draws from the Tao. For example, from the negative formulation of the Golden Rule to the positive formulation of the Golden Rule. And if you look at the history of poetry and composition, you see there's a kind of evolution of style, surely of language, things of which I am not expert, so I'm not going to go into it, but I can't. So innovation attempts to impose change, right? This innovation for the sake of posterity and scientific progress, again, they step outside the Tao ultimately for the sake of throwing it away. So Gaius Anticius's little book there, I mean, this is a remarkable observation that Lewis is offering us. Let me drink some more water. That little book actually projects the project of Elon Musk, and if you like, of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, right? And of the World Economic Forum, these people who want us to get hooked into computers and become what they call transhuman. I mean, they speak openly about this. I mean, the guy who just got fired, what's his name? Klaus Schwab. This is his project. His official court philosopher, Yuval Harari, is more circumspect. He says, well, maybe, maybe not. But he seems to think that's an interesting idea, certainly. Let's do this. Okay. So that brings us to chapter 3, the abolition of man. So this is all very extremely timely now, because now we're talking about transhumanism. I recommend if you haven't heard of transhumanism, you have to look it up. Okay, you have to Google it. Google transhumanism. Transhumanism is the abolition of man. Okay, well, let's see what that means, because without having heard of transhumanism, Lewis figured it out on his own, and way back in the 40s. Okay, so I tell you that we've been living in the same world for at least 100 years, and I'll say 500 years. Okay, I'll tell you why in a moment. You can bring it back to antiquity. I'll just say 500 years or so. So we talk about man's, or today humankind's, conquest of nature. And there's a popular way of thinking about that, which is Lewis shows pretty convincingly it's false. Popular idea is that humankind as a whole stands outside of nature as a whole, and humankind as a whole increases in power as nature becomes weaker. Right? And power is a relational property. To have power is to have power over something. In this case, power over nature. But is that the case? Is there a steady increase of the power of our species over nature? That's false. What we actually encounter is the increase of power of a small number of our species over the vast majority of other members of our species, and of course over external nature, non-human nature as a whole. The people who create, distribute, maintain, and control the technology, those are the persons who really possess or enjoy a certain amplification of power relative to all other persons in the cosmos. Okay. Now, small number of people who control it, they get to decide who benefits from the technology. So there are all sorts of persons online who tell you that the government has technology they're holding back. And you wonder, I mean, we know that they have directed energy weapons because they've talked about that out loud. Mark Esper talked about that back in 2019. And apparently they've used them. And I think China used their directed energy weapons to cook some Indian soldiers in the mountain range in the Himalayas there, in some disputed territory. They didn't kill them. It was sort of an experiment. They heated them up a bit. That was way back. That was like in 2020 or something like that. And, there are people who speculate that the fire in Hawaii that wiped out Lahaina, for which each person got a check of $700, while people from outside the country are put up in 4-star hotels in New York, which is true, because I happen to know, people who know these people. Okay, that fire in Lahaina was caused by directed energy weapons, and they try to produce evidence to that effect that fires began from inside the tree, and if that wasn't AI generated, then that would be an interesting feature there, and that nothing of a certain shade of blue could burn because it reflects. It doesn't allow the laser technology heated up. so yeah, that's actually interesting. I don't know. I'm not going to insist on that. As soon as you say something like that, somebody says conspiracy theory, and that supposedly is a refutation. I think that phrase is basically discredited at this point because too many weird things have happened, like the Hunter Biden laptop. You know, oh, you believe in that? You're a conspiracy theorist. Well, it turns out it's true, right? And the guy is rather significant criminal. And you know, the Biden family was involved in some kind of crime in Ukraine. That's a conspiracy theory, but there's Joe Biden on film saying that he pressured the government to fire the prosecutor investigating his son. He said, if you don't do it, I'm going to withhold the $4 billion aid package we have prepared for you. That's a criminal action, and nothing's been done about it. Welcome to the world of sovereignty, folks. In the world of sovereignty, the law is created on the spot without regard to written rules, because there's the distinction. I'm sort of leaping out of the text here. I'll just say this quickly. You know what? I'll save that for next week because we'll talk about that next week. All right. So, and you know, you can find the way that the Trump administration is handling the whole Doge thing. There are illegalities happening there. They're just ignoring them. Okay. So I'm not trying to be partisan here. I'm not really for any political party. That there's no salvation coming from a human being, so I'm not worried about political parties. All right, here, let's see. Let's get some examples here. How about airplanes? Airplanes have empowered all of us. Well, they've disempowered, I guess, millions of people ultimately who have been killed by bombs dropped from airplanes, right? So they were made weaker thanks to the progress of technology. Then there's communications technology. And with that, we gain genuine information, but also billions of people end up being propagandized. They're made weaker. Their beliefs are programmed more or less, and therefore their behavior likewise is programmed. Okay, that can be proved too, by the way. The psychologists study this stuff. Look up Dr. Robert Epstein. He has a website called stopbigtechnow.com. And he shows that Google basically can program people. Not like 5% of the population. They can get more than half of the persons in a population to do what they want them to do. Okay, you don't believe me? Go to his website and look at that stuff. You got to wake up, guys. We understand where you're living. In a multi-state world system, some states exercise power over others. For example, the United States over the entire third world, and now increasingly China, of course. In democracies, majorities exercise power over minorities. Okay? And if the majority controls the technology, then that power amplifies proportionally, correct? And then on the temporal plane, those alive exercise power over all future generations. And then he says, if we continue to progress in technology, the persons who stepped outside the Tao, eventually they'll succeed. And that's how they're talking today, effectively. I mean, they don't use the vocabulary of the Tao, but they're talking about becoming all-powerful and establishing, or an approximation to being all-powerful and establishing the transhuman epoch, at which time they'll just basically discard all previous values. They'll have assumed power over all previous generations who were involved in maintaining something and projecting that into the future, and absolute power over all future generations because they'll cut those people to the shape that they desire. And that'll be that. So that'll be the point where power is maximized in a small number of people and everyone else will be their patients, as it were. Not in the sense of a medical practice, but in the sense of receiving acts of power and being shaped thoroughly by those acts of power. That's what Nietzscheanism leads to also, by the way, if you want to stick by your Nietzsche philosophy. Okay, so advances in eugenics and scientific conditioning will make one generation or part of it, I said that, all powerful with respect to all future, but also prior generations. I should have added that. All future and prior generations. So this very same generation will, I'm sorry, I already said that. Pardon me for not tracking with my own lecture here. So these persons will have dispensed with the Tao. This is the important part. They really will. So it's an interesting thing that Lewis is saying here. You would think that given everything he said up through chapter 2, one would conclude that one cannot step out of the Tao. One's going to rely upon the Tao. He's saying, well, not quite. You can go ahead and deny all values, right? All values of the Tao. Just step outside of it and then create. This almost sounds like Nietzsche. You can create what you want. I'm not certain I agree with him. I mean, what new values could you possibly create? I don't think I agree with that. Why don't I agree? Because I can't think of any new values, and I've done a lot of reading too, and I can't think of anyone else who's thought of new values. At best, they've taken old values and they've kind of deformed them and magnified them, and they smashed the other ones. So that's what I've seen. But he maintains that we can step outside the Tao and control the Tao. Not control it, create a new Tao. That's his point. Okay. So why would anyone do this? What would be the motivation? It's point 2 here. Well, apparently these people start with the Tao at first, right? I mean, there is this kind of concern for benefiting mankind, benefiting posterity. That is a feature of the Tao, alongside a whole bunch of other features. But ultimately, they have to acknowledge, as scientific power over other human beings and nature amplifies, magnifies, that it really is up to them to determine men's conscience and the good. Okay? So look at our recent time. When I was a kid, the idea of homosexual marriage was it wasn't really acknowledged as a possibility. People get married to produce children, have a family, and that's the end of it. Okay, if two men want to live together, that's something else. But the idea of a homosexual marriage, when I was growing up, guys, I'm not judging. That was a round square, right? That can't be. Now it's the law of the land, and what beyond that? The idea that a person who can father a child can feel in his bones he's actually a woman, and that feeling, okay, that conviction, that makes him a woman. Okay, that is something completely new. Okay, and I'm not going to say where that came from, but one philosophy that tries to explain where this social phenomenon, right, of the widespread acceptance of the doctrine that human beings can determine their sex and gender on the basis of conviction, is that it got propagandized into a whole segment of the public. Okay, I'm not saying it's true or false, but that's a theory. And we're living in a time when the family has fallen apart, communities have fallen apart, persons are not comfortable in their skin. Let's say didn't have a good relationship with their parents at home or their siblings, were bullied at school. They basically feel like garbage, and they're wondering why they feel like garbage. And they get online, and there are these little communities that say, well, the reason you feel like garbage is because you're actually a woman trapped in a man's body, or you're actually a man trapped in a woman's body, or you're not either of those two things. You're anything of 67 different genders. You have to have compassion for people because they're suffering. This is not an attempt to make fun of anybody, and don't you do it. Okay? One theory is that is effectively what happened. And that had you given these people another plausible explanation, or even an implausible explanation, but said it with soothing tones and encouragement, invited them into a kind of online community where they actually, for the first time in their lives, felt accepted by someone, they would have bought into that theory. You follow me? Okay, so you guys think about that. Whether that's true or false or not, I'm not going to say. I'm just going to say that's a theory. So here's the sequence of observations we have to draw with Lewis here. The controllers, because they control the Tao, will cease to be men. I mean, this is how we're human beings, what he means. This actually follows. And if you think about transhumanism, the transhumanists are interested in creating is what they call super intelligence, like plugging your mind into Rockefeller Library at Brown. So any question you have is instantly answered. Super longevity, so you'll live for like a million years or longer. The only thing that'll kill you is an asteroid or falling off a cliff, or even then they can fix you, right? And you'll be super happy too. You'll experience a continuous elation. Is that a human being? It doesn't correspond to anything we've experienced. That's more like a god, right? Okay, so that's not a human being. It maybe might bear an external resemblance to a human being with a couple of legs, 2 arms, and a face and whatnot, but it's not really a human being. So these controllers, if they make themselves into these transhuman superhuman beings, or transhumans, or even posthumans, I would say, they will not be bad people. Not according to their own standard. They're not going to be, not merely will they not be bad, they'll define themselves as good, of course. They won't even be human. That's the important part. It eliminates our species. Transhumanism is posthumanism. Okay, you follow me? Transhumanism is really posthumanism. So their subjects themselves will not be unhappy human beings. They will not be human beings at all, but artifacts. Do you guys follow me? This gets rid of the species. All right. So one motive will remain to them, however. This is the rub, because it's not like they just enjoy an unqualified victory. That's not the case. Sic volo. I guess we're in classical Latin here. Sic volo, sic jubeo. If I will it, I command it. That is, those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse. Okay, this is the rub. If we become transhuman, we're trying hard to do it. They poured hundreds of billions of dollars into it, and don't make any mistake. That was a Starlink or Stargate project that Trump just poured $500 billion we don't have into. That's a transhumanist project, okay? Amongst other things. Artificial intelligence, the original motivation behind, I've studied this, the original motivation behind artificial intelligence is artificial general intelligence. That is making something that's like a human being. Right now they have facial recognition technology, that's one thing. Translation technology, that's the second thing. You know, text generating technology, like a ChatGPT, that's a third thing. None of these things are integrated, guys. So none of that is like a human being. Those are just really, really impressive programs. What they want to do is integrate all that stuff and make a human being. Well, actually, no, it's something superhuman. They want to make a god is what they want to do. And then they want to upload everybody into that thing to make us transhuman, which is, I say, to make us posthuman. Okay, that's the project. That's what they talk about at the World Economic Forum. That's what they talk about in the robotics labs and AI labs at MIT and at tech institutions all over the United States and all over the globe. And they're pushing this as hard as they possibly can in China, because they have a doctrine there that whoever gets to AGI first will dominate the world. Okay? You guys follow me? This kind of talk is common. Back in the day, Lyndon B. Johnson said, whoever controls weather warfare will control the world. Right? So there's always somebody who says, oh, yeah, this technology will control the world. But in any event, this one looks promising, right? I mean, if you do have AGI, that would seem to be the most powerful technology out there, and then you would control the world, because it would be able to hack into any computer system. You'd be able to turn off other people's utility systems, so on and so forth, shut down their nuclear weapons, right? Then you control everything. Shut down their stock market. You have absolute control over those people. That's the end of it. You can just leave them all to starve to death, or you can, allow them to live under your conditions imposed, and they can't do anything about it. They have to accept it. Okay. But that's just at the level of international relations here. Let's get back to the philosophy. So the difficulty here is that these people, they're going to have to come up with their own Tao, right? What's going to do that? Okay, it turns out that they're going to have to look at something which is, as it were, 10,000 miles subterranean relative to the Tao, and that's the base instincts of our animal nature. Turns out that the pig and the dog and the horse are going to win after all. Okay, and the strongest impulses, because they're not going to prefer their weak impulses, certainly, right? The strongest impulses will prevail. Okay, so in the great drama of human history, we now have two choices. You can either live within and be obedient to the Tao, and that requires reflection, and people will have differences, right? You can be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, sub-branches of the same, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, and so on and so forth within the Tao. So there's that discussion going on there, but they're all in the Tao. And on the other side of the divide, ultimately you'll be subject to mere impulse to become an absolute slave. So that's a very curious. I mean, so these persons who are aiming at becoming masters and possessors of nature by becoming transhuman, by merging with AGI, in the final analysis, they're going to become slaves. I'm going to modify Lewis slightly. They're going to become slaves either of their strongest impulses or slaves of the AGI, because it turns out that artificial intelligence, this has already happened, can fashion capacities for itself that are not programmed into it. And once you have AGI, there's no predicting what they're going to be able to, what that artificial intelligence is going to be able to do. And there's no upper limit on the degree of power it can assign itself, right? Or it can achieve. So we're living in frightening times, guys. Sorry. Please don't shoot the messengers. Not my fault. All right. So from Lewis's point of view, he didn't think about the AGI thing. Natural impulse will win the final victory over human beings. Anyways, it's not surprising he didn't think about it. They only launched that project in 1956. Okay, so we reduce things to mere nature in science. Notice this. You can look at a tree and write a poem about it, or you can say that's a natural artifact to study, right? The scientific attitude is one of objectification and power, and reducing things to one's power. You reduce things to an object of nature so you can conquer it, okay? But the following Lewis's observations to the end, there's a price that one pays for this conquest. You end up losing your soul and becoming a slave to your impulses. He might be ultimately be right, because when they program the AGI, how are they going to? What parameters will they prefer? They'll prefer those which correlate with their strongest impulses, right? Okay. I think it actually gets worse. I think human beings either rise or they sink. We don't stay in the middle. And I've seen this in my lifetime, because I've seen people who had many things going for them back when they were teenagers and in their 20s, and they turned towards what they did is they adopted an inverted scale of values and began pursuing money and power and pleasure as if these were the ends of life, as opposed to virtue and nobility and holiness. And they contracted. They kind of collapsed into themselves. And I suggest that just keeps going. I think there's something even lower. I think Lewis, he definitely agrees with me on this. There's something even lower than your natural impulses, and that is a demonic will. And then you find persons who actually adopt evil. I hate to sound rather dark, but I think people embark upon this project of the Tao. I think very quickly, they will be wrestling with demonic impulses. And I think that's probably happening already. Okay. Oh, it does sound dark and conspiratorial and kind of depressing, and you need to turn me off and just ignore me. And yeah, I mean, have a good day. After this, I want you to sit down. I want you to brew a cup of tea. I want you to make a nice bowl of ice cream and enjoy yourself. If you have a friend, talk to your friend. If there's some music you like, put that on. Have a good time. All right. Don't let my dark talk depress you. Okay. And by the way, all that is powerless in relation to or in opposition to persons of true moral courage. All right. And we can talk about that more next week. All right. So let's see here. So the price of conquest is to treat as mere nature, a thing as mere nature, and thus to expand nature's domain. So as we treat things as mere nature, we expand nature's domain, but ultimately we end up surrendering ourselves to the power of nature. See that curious dialectic? So we embark upon the project of becoming masters and possessors of nature. We do this by treating things as mere sort of billiard balls and blocks of concrete we can push around. And in the final analysis, we treat ourselves that way, and then the final analysis, we end up being slaves to our own basest impulses, or possibly worse. So in the final step, the being who stands to gain is identical with the being that is sacrificed. And next week, I'll try to show you that what's behind all of this is actually something you haven't thought about probably, and that's a scapegoating mechanism. And it's rather shocking. It is arresting and chilling to recognize that the tendency to scapegoat, or the instinct to scapegoat, is now being exercised in the transhumanist project. So as far as scapegoating, that's just a group of people gathering together and purchasing unity at the expense of someone else, or maybe a small number of people, right? Every time you gossip, you're scapegoating. So now you gossip with your friends about somebody else. Now you have unity with your friends against someone else. It's a negative tendency in human nature. You should actually make an exercise of not gossiping. As a matter of fact, I'll build that into my next ethics course. Take 3 days and don't gossip. And then take 3 days and don't use any foul language. And take 3 days and don't complain. And then take 3 days and go out of your way to help somebody in need. Okay? Beyond merely being polite and holding the door for people. And so on. Take 3 days and act very deliberately. Get right out of bed. Move with a steady pace. Don't rush, but don't slow down either. Don't procrastinate. 3 days. keep the other things going. Okay, so those sorts of exercises are virtue builders. You become a better person that way. All right, guys, that's what I have to say to you. All right, and I'll give you a new assignment, and we'll pick up next week. Be well.